Story 1: The Lake Arrowhead Nightmare. Sometimes, the most peaceful places can harbor the most harrowing dangers. Imagine being alone in your cozy RV parked by a quiet, moonlit lake. The gentle rustle of leaves is your lullaby, and the soft glow of a table lamp is your only companion. But then, in the dead silence of the night, there's a knock at your door, a sound so soft it feels like the wind might have caused it. Yet, it comes again, deliberate and insistent. Would you open the door? Would you trust a stranger's voice when you're miles from help? This was the nightmare I faced at Lake Arrowhead, California, a night that turned my peaceful solitude into a chilling fight for survival. If you've ever camped alone or considered the allure of nature's quiet embrace, stay with me. You'll want to hear how quickly the serene can turn sinister. And as you do, share your thoughts. Would you have opened that door? It was a crisp October evening, and the campground was nearly deserted, a dream come true for someone like me, who craved solitude. My RV was parked in a secluded spot near the woods, far from the main road. A few other RVs dotted the area, but they were distant enough that I felt completely alone. By 9 p.m., I had cooked dinner and settled into the cozy glow of my RV. The windows were shut tight against the chilly air, and my favorite thriller streamed on my laptop. Everything felt perfect. But as the clock struck 11 p.m., that perfection shattered with a knock. At first, I froze, unsure if I had imagined it. It was soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. But then it came again. My heart thudded against my ribs as I approached the door. Through the peephole, I could only see darkness, shapes shifting in the moonlight, but no clear figure. "Who's there?" I called, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. A man's voice answered, calm and even. "Hey. Sorry to bother you. My car broke down up the road. Could I use your phone to call for help?" My unease deepened. Why would he come to me when there were other RVs closer to the main road? Why hadn't I heard a car pull up or seen headlights? "Where's your car?" I asked, my voice sharper now. "Just up the road," he replied. "I didn't see anyone else around. Please. It's freezing out here." My instincts screamed that something wasn't right. "I'm sorry," I said firmly. "I can't help you. Try the other RVs." For a long moment, there was silence. Then he spoke again, his voice lower, more insistent. "Are you sure? I don't want to be out here any longer than I have to." The conversation had taken a darker turn, and I felt the temperature in the RV drop, not from the cold, but from the weight of fear pressing on me. I backed away from the door, my eyes glued to the handle. Then, the handle rattled. Panic surged through me. I had locked the door earlier, but hearing the metallic clink as the man tried to force it open made my blood run cold. "I told you to leave," I shouted, gripping the nearest object, a heavy flashlight. But he didn't leave. The rattling stopped for a moment, and then there was a loud, deliberate thud against the door. My heart pounded as I backed into the kitchen, my eyes scanning for anything I could use as a weapon. The door flew open with a violent crash, slamming against the wall. Standing there was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his face partially hidden by the hood of a dark sweatshirt. His wild eyes locked onto mine as he stepped inside. "Get out!" I screamed, swinging the flashlight with all my strength. It connected with his shoulder, and he stumbled back, cursing under his breath. But he wasn't done. He lunged toward me, grabbing my wrist and trying to wrestle the flashlight away. My mind raced as I struggled against his iron grip. Then I saw it, a small kitchen knife glinting on the counter. With all the strength I could muster, I broke free, grabbed the knife, and swung. I don't know if I hit him, but it was enough to send him retreating toward the door. "You crazy bee *********, he snarled before disappearing into the night. My hands shook as I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I called the police, and though they arrived quickly, the man was gone, leaving only faint footprints in the dirt outside. Even now, every time I think of that night, my pulse quickens. What would have happened if I hadn't fought back? If I hadn't grabbed that knife? Camping alone always felt like freedom, a way to escape the chaos of life. But now, I see it differently. Solitude is a double-edged sword, and safety is something you can never take for granted. To those who cherish the serenity of being alone in nature, I have this advice: always trust your instincts, and never assume you're truly alone. But that wasn't the last time I felt the creeping presence of danger while camping. In another secluded spot, surrounded by towering trees and the sound of silence, I discovered how the shadows themselves could play tricks on your mind, or perhaps how something lurking within them could be far more real than I ever imagined. Join me in Shadows in Shasta Lake, where the quiet of the night holds a terror of its own. Story 2: Shadows in Shasta Lake. Isolation is a double-edged sword. It offers peace, silence, and a chance to connect with nature, but what if someone, or something, is watching you the entire time? Imagine parking your RV in a secluded area, the towering pines of Shasta Lake surrounding you, and the world beyond fading into a comforting quiet. The crackle of a camp stove is your only soundtrack, and the dim glow of the stars is your only light. But then, out of the corner of your eye, you see a shadow glide past the window. Just wildlife, you tell yourself. And yet, as night falls deeper, the rhythmic tapping on the side of your RV suggests otherwise. Would you dare to look outside? Would you stay quiet and wait for it to leave, or would you confront the shadows lurking just beyond the safety of your walls? This is my story of Shasta Lake, where I learned the hard way that solitude isn't always safe. As you follow along, let me know, what would you have done in my place? The day had been perfect. Shasta Lake in Northern California was quiet, almost eerily so. It was the off-season, so the campground was mostly empty, a dream for someone like me who sought solace away from the chaos of everyday life. I parked my RV in a small, secluded clearing, not far from the water but hidden enough that I wouldn't have to worry about passing hikers or other campers. The towering pines swayed gently in the breeze, and the lake mirrored the fading light of the sunset. After a quick walk along the shoreline, I returned to my RV to prepare dinner. As I chopped vegetables, my gaze wandered to the small window above the sink. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving outside. It was fleeting, a quick blur across my line of sight. My hand froze mid-chop as my heart skipped a beat. It's just a deer, I told myself. Or maybe a raccoon. Wildlife was common in areas like this, and the woods could play tricks on your eyes. Shaking off the unease, I finished cooking and settled in for the night, the comforting hum of the RV's heater lulling me into a sense of security. By 11 p.m., the world outside was pitch black. The silence was so thick it felt oppressive, and every creak of the RV seemed amplified. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking them out of habit, before climbing into bed. I must have dozed off, but it couldn't have been for long. A sound jolted me awake, a rhythmic tapping on the side of the RV. It was faint at first, like the soft knock of a branch in the wind. But as I strained to listen, the pattern became deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. My chest tightened as I sat up, every nerve in my body on high alert. Grabbing the flashlight from beside my bed, I moved cautiously toward the window. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that made my ears ring. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the dirt and pine needles outside. Who would be out here at this hour? And why would they circle my RV? My mouth went dry as the footsteps continued, pacing around the vehicle in an unnervingly methodical way. I turned off all the lights inside, plunging myself into darkness, hoping that whoever, or whatever, was out there would think I was asleep. But then came the scraping. It was a sharp, grating sound, like a knife being dragged across metal. It started on the back panel of the RV and worked its way forward, the sound setting my teeth on edge. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. I fumbled for my alarm remote, a precaution I'd bought but never imagined needing. My fingers trembled as I gripped it tightly, hovering over the panic button. Then, without warning, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, every second stretching into eternity. I thought, for a fleeting moment, that it might be over. And then the window shattered. The sound was deafening, shards of glass scattering across the floor. My flashlight beam darted to the source, catching a glimpse of a figure, tall, cloaked in shadows, their face obscured by the darkness. They didn't speak. They didn't hesitate. They lunged for the door, rattling the handle with a ferocity that made my blood run cold. I didn't think, I just acted. My thumb slammed down on the panic button, and the alarm erupted in a shrill, ear-piercing scream. The intruder froze, clearly startled, before stumbling backward and disappearing into the woods. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, clutching the alarm remote like a lifeline. Every creak of the RV made me jump. Every gust of wind sent shivers down my spine. I didn't dare look out the shattered window, afraid of what I might see staring back at me. As dawn broke, I wasted no time packing up and leaving the campground. The morning light revealed footprints circling the RV, their erratic pattern suggesting the intruder had been watching me for hours before deciding to strike. Even now, the memory of that night haunts me. The peace of nature has lost its charm, replaced by an unshakable sense of vulnerability. I haven't camped alone since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. To anyone who ventures into the wilderness seeking solitude, I have one piece of advice: always be prepared for the shadows. You never know what might be lurking in them. But the terror didn't end there. Solitude in nature can be deceiving. But what happens when the danger doesn't just watch from outside? What if it forces its way in, shattering the fragile barrier between safety and chaos? Join me in the Big Bear Lake encounter, where a peaceful getaway turns into a fight for survival within the very walls meant to protect you. Story 3: The Big Bear Lake Encounter. What if the locks you trust to keep you safe couldn't hold back the danger? Imagine waking up in the dead of night, in the middle of nowhere, to the sound of someone, or something, trying to break into your sanctuary. The thought alone is chilling. But for one camper near Big Bear Lake, it became an all-too-real nightmare. It started as the perfect day, a serene hike, the fresh mountain air, and a peaceful campsite tucked away from the chaos of the world. But as the stars blanketed the night sky, something sinister stirred in the darkness. A faint scraping sound. A shadow outside the window. And then, the sound of the lock snapping. Would you have the courage to fight back? Could you face the unknown and protect yourself in such a vulnerable moment? Stay with me as I recount the terror of that night and the fight for survival that left scars far deeper than any physical wound. And as you listen, share your thoughts. What's your worst camping fear? And how would you have reacted? It was early fall, and Big Bear Lake was stunning that time of year. The golden leaves reflected off the water like shards of amber, and the cool mountain breeze carried the crisp scent of pine. After a stressful week, I craved solitude and decided to spend the weekend camping alone. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near the lake, surrounded by towering pines and the soft murmur of water lapping against the shore. The day was perfect. I hiked for hours, exploring trails that twisted through the forest, and returned to my RV feeling refreshed and accomplished. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cooked a simple meal and settled in for the night. The silence was comforting, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before crawling into bed, feeling completely secure. But security is an illusion, as I was about to learn. The first sound was faint, almost imperceptible, a light scraping against the side of the RV. At first, I dismissed it, assuming it was a branch brushing against the metal in the breeze. But as I lay there, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. I sat up, my heart pounding, grabbing my phone. I checked the time, 2:47 a.m. My first instinct was to dismiss it as an animal, but something about the rhythm of the noise unsettled me. Animals don't move like that. Then, I heard it, the distinct, metallic rattle of the RV door handle. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was outside, testing the locks. My mind raced with questions. Who would be out here at this hour? What did they want? Were they alone? The rattling grew more aggressive, the door shaking violently as the intruder tried to force it open. I froze, paralyzed by fear, as a shadow moved past the thin fabric of the blinds near my bed. Whoever it was, they were tall, their figure looming ominously just beyond the window. My eyes darted to the small flashlight on the table beside me. It was the only object within reach that could be used as a weapon. Slowly, I grabbed it, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. A loud crack shattered the silence. The lock had snapped. The door creaked open, revealing a man silhouetted against the faint glow of moonlight. He stepped inside, his face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothes that seemed to blend into the shadows. "Don't move," he said, his voice low and steady. But I couldn't obey. My survival instincts took over, and I swung the flashlight with all my strength, striking his arm. He let out a grunt of pain but didn't retreat. Instead, he lunged toward me, his hands grabbing at the flashlight. We struggled, the confined space of the RV amplifying every sound, the scuffle of feet, the ragged gasps of breath, the heavy thud of bodies colliding. Desperation gave me strength. I kicked at him, breaking free for a moment, and scrambled toward the kitchen. There, on the counter, was a knife. I grabbed it, brandishing it with shaking hands. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice breaking with terror. The man hesitated, his wild eyes flicking between me and the knife. For a moment, I thought he might rush me. But then he cursed under his breath and backed toward the door. "This isn't over," he muttered before disappearing into the night. I slammed the door shut, locking it as best I could, and collapsed to the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. The police arrived 20 minutes later. But by then, the intruder was long gone. They found footprints in the dirt around the RV, circling it multiple times before stopping at the door. The thought made my skin crawl. He had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The officers told me I was lucky. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt violated, vulnerable, and painfully aware of how unprepared I had been. I left Big Bear Lake the next morning, swearing never to camp alone in an isolated area again. That night changed me. It stripped away the illusion of safety I had always taken for granted. Now, whenever I hear a strange noise in the night, I freeze, my mind flashing back to the shadowy figure that shattered my sense of peace. If you've ever camped alone, I urge you to take every precaution. Lock your doors, stay alert, and trust your instincts. Because out there in the wilderness, the locks you trust might not be enough to keep danger at bay. But sometimes, danger doesn't come in the form of a person. Sometimes, it's something you can't see or understand, something that defies explanation. Join me in the Flute in the woods, where a haunting melody led two unsuspecting hikers into a nightmare they'll never forget. Story 4: The Flute in the Woods. The woods are alive at night, but not always in ways you'd expect. Have you ever walked a dark trail? The quiet pressing in on all sides, only to hear something, a sound that doesn't belong? Now, imagine that sound is a haunting melody. A flute playing softly through the trees. At first, it seems far away, almost comforting. But then it grows louder, closer. What would you do if that melody started following you, wrapping itself around the silence of the night, until it felt like the darkness itself was humming with it? This is what I experienced one fateful night in San Antonio's O.P. Schnabel Park, a night that left me questioning whether I had encountered a person, a spirit, or something far worse. Would you have stopped to listen? Or would you have run before it was too late? I'll admit it was a bad idea from the start. Walking through the woods at 3 a.m. is hardly the smartest choice. But my date and I were thrill seekers. We wanted something out of the ordinary. And the quiet, sprawling trails of O.P. Schnabel Park seemed like the perfect place. The night was warm, the air heavy with the scent of earth and pine. Our flashlights cut thin beams through the darkness, illuminating the gravel path ahead. The city felt a world away as we ventured deeper into the woods, the faint sounds of traffic fading into silence. At first, everything was normal. The occasional rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, it was peaceful. Then, about a mile in, we heard it, a soft, lilting tune drifting through the trees. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the breeze carrying a distant echo. We stopped in our tracks, exchanging a confused glance. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," they replied, their voice uneasy. "It sounds like a flute." The melody was slow and haunting, each note hanging in the air like a question. There was no rhythm, no clear pattern, just an eerie, wandering tune. Maybe it's someone practicing? I suggested. Though even as I said it, I felt a knot of doubt tightening in my stomach. What kind of person plays the flute in the woods at 3 a.m.? We continued walking, the melody following us like an invisible companion. At first, it seemed harmless, maybe even a little intriguing. But then it grew louder, closer. The knot of doubt turned into a ball of dread as the tune seemed to come from every direction. It wasn't just one flute, it sounded like a chorus, each note overlapping in a discordant harmony. "Let's turn back," my date said, their voice trembling. I nodded, trying to ignore the prickling sensation creeping up the back of my neck. But as we retraced our steps, the melody only grew louder. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the beam caught something darting across the path ahead, a blur of movement too fast to identify. "What was that?" they whispered, clutching my arm. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible over the sound of the flute. We quickened our pace, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. But the forest felt alive now. Shadows danced just beyond the reach of our flashlights, and the melody seemed to twist and warp, each note sharper and more menacing than the last. The turning point came when we reached a fork in the trail. To our horror, the melody was coming from both directions. It was as if the forest itself was playing the flute, surrounding us in a symphony of dread. "We have to keep moving," I said, though I wasn't sure which path to take. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But run where? A sudden rustling to our left made the decision for us. Without a word, we bolted down the right-hand trail, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran. The melody chased us, growing louder and more erratic, like it was feeding off our fear. Then, it happened. Something huge, something I couldn't see but could feel, rushed across the trail behind us. The sheer force of its movement sent a gust of wind that extinguished my flashlight. I screamed, fumbling with the switch. But the light refused to come back on. My date grabbed my hand, pulling me forward as we ran blindly through the dark. The flute was deafening now, each note stabbing into my ears like shards of ice. I could feel the presence behind us, the ground shaking slightly with its weight. Finally, the trees thinned, and the faint outline of our truck appeared in the distance. We sprinted toward it, throwing ourselves into the cab and slamming the doors shut. We sat there, gasping for breath, our wide eyes scanning the forest. The flute had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt even worse. I turned on the headlights, illuminating the empty trail ahead. There was no sign of anyone, or anything, that could have been responsible for the sounds. "Let's get out of here," my date said, their voice barely above a whisper. I didn't need convincing. The engine roared to life, and we sped out of the park, leaving the haunting melody behind. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. Was it a person playing a cruel prank? A wandering spirit? Or something far older and more dangerous than either? All I know is that I've never returned to OP Schnabel Park after dark. And I never will. Would you? But the strange and unexplained aren't confined to the woods. Sometimes they find you in places where you're supposed to feel safe. Join me in the haunting on the 5th floor, where the eerie halls of an empty hospital reveal secrets best left undisturbed. Story 5, The Haunting on the 5th Floor. There's something unnerving about hospitals at night. The bright, sterile hallways that buzz with life during the day become silent and oppressive after hours. The shadows seem to stretch longer, The silence grows heavier. And every creak of a door feels like a warning. Now imagine being alone in one of those hallways. The flicker of a fluorescent light your only companion. You hear the faint creak of a door behind you. But when you turn, no one's there. Then, as you pass an empty wing under renovation, you see something impossible, a patient coding. Blood pouring from every orifice. You rush to help. But when you enter the room, it's empty. This is what happened to me during one unforgettable night shift. Was it sleep deprivation playing tricks on my mind? Or was I face to face with something otherworldly? Let me tell you my story. And you can decide for yourself. And as you listen, share your thoughts. What's the most unsettling experience you've had when working late at night? I worked the night shift as a pharmacy tech at a small hospital. Most nights were uneventful, filled with organizing medications and preparing doses for the morning staff. The hum of machinery and the occasional crackle of the intercom were my only distractions. The 5th floor of the hospital was under renovation. And it had been empty for months. Most of the staff avoided it. It was eerie walking past the dimly lit hallways. The construction tarps swaying slightly as though moved by an unseen hand. I didn't think much of it. Hospitals are strange places at night. And I chalked the odd sensations up to the building itself. That night, though, felt different from the start. Around 2 a.m., I stepped out of the pharmacy to grab a drink from the vending machine in the break room. The halls were deserted. As usual. The distant beep of a heart monitor the only sound. But as I approached the vending machine, I heard the faint creak of a door. I stopped and turned, scanning the hallway. Nothing. The door creaked again. Louder this time. And I realized it was coming from the direction of the 5th floor stairwell. My stomach tightened. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. Security had locked the entire floor weeks ago to keep out wanderers. Ignoring the unease creeping up my spine, I shook it off and returned to my post. An hour later, I had just finished restocking a cabinet when the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. They were soft but deliberate. Each step measured, as though someone didn't want to be heard. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the hair on my arms stood on end. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the hallway, shining the beam toward the stairwell. The door to the 5th floor was slightly ajar. My pulse quickened as I approached. It was probably just a janitor or a member of the maintenance crew, I told myself. But the silence beyond the door was deafening. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air on the 5th floor was different, stale and heavy, carrying the faint smell of antiseptic and dust. My flashlight cut through the dimness, revealing tarped walls, empty hospital beds, and scattered tools. As I moved further into the wing, I heard a faint, rhythmic beeping. My heart sank. It sounded like a heart monitor. But that didn't make sense. There wasn't supposed to be any equipment left up here. The beeping grew louder as I approached one of the patient rooms. The door was slightly open, and I could see a faint light spilling out. I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, I saw a man lying on the hospital bed, his body convulsing as alarms blared from the monitor beside him. Blood seeped from his eyes, nose, and mouth, staining the white sheets crimson. "Code blue," I shouted instinctively, fumbling for my radio. But when I blinked, the room was empty. The bed was perfectly made, the monitor dark and silent. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I backed out of the room. my breath coming in short gasps. I turned to leave. But as I stepped into the hallway, a figure blocked my path. It was a man in a security uniform, standing perfectly still. His face was eerily familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen him before. He smiled, a slow, unsettling curve of his lips, and raised a hand to pat my shoulder. "You should get back to work," he said, his voice low and calm. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Something about him felt wrong. Shaking, I made my way back to the pharmacy, determined to avoid the 5th floor for the rest of the night. But as I passed by the elevator, something caught my eye. The man was standing in one of the windows on the 5th floor, staring down at me. His figure was backlit by the faint glow of moonlight, his face blank and expressionless. I stumbled backward, my chest tightening with fear. When I looked again, he was gone. I spent the rest of my shift in a haze, questioning what I had seen. By the time the morning staff arrived, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I told one of the nurses about the man in the security uniform, describing him in detail. She went pale. "That sounds like Dave," she said quietly. "He was one of the security guards here. Died of a heart attack a few years ago, right here on the 5th floor." The blood drained from my face. To this day, I don't know if what I saw was real or the product of exhaustion. But I'll never forget the look on that man's face, or the way he smiled at me as if he knew something I didn't. Hospitals are strange places, full of life and death, hope and despair. Sometimes, I wonder if the lines between the living and the dead blur just enough for us to see what's on the other side. Would you have gone to the 5th floor? But not all hauntings take place in hospitals. Sometimes, they come to you in the safety of your own home. Join me in the window knock, where the familiar comfort of a quiet night is shattered by the sound of someone, or something, at your window. Story 6, The Window Knock. When someone knocks on your window in the dead of night, it's never for a good reason. There's something inherently unnatural about the sound, sharp and jarring against the backdrop of silence. It cuts through your sense of security, leaving you with a single, unsettling thought: you're not alone. But what if the knocking didn't stop, even when you ignored it? What if the faint voice outside, a man pleading for help, wasn't what it seemed? This is my story, and it began with a simple sound. At first, I thought it was just a prank, maybe even my imagination. But as the nights wore on, the knocking grew more insistent, more malevolent, until it escalated into something I can't fully explain. If you've ever been home alone and heard a noise that didn't belong, stay with me. You'll want to hear how this unfolded. And as you listen, ask yourself, would you have answered the door? Or would you have ignored it, hoping the danger would simply go away? It was late October, just a few nights before Halloween. The crisp autumn air carried the faint smell of burning wood, and the streets were quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. My family was out of town for the weekend, leaving me with the house to myself. I wasn't bothered by being alone. I'd always enjoyed the solitude. That night, after a long day of work, I decided to relax. I cooked a simple dinner, curled up on the couch, and put on one of my favorite horror movies. The house was warm and cozy, the kind of atmosphere that makes you feel completely at ease. It was just after 11 p.m. when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks. At first, I thought I had imagined it. I paused the movie and listened. my heart thudding in my chest. The sound came again. Louder this time. And undeniably real. Knock. 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 I stood and approached the front door. My bare feet quiet against the hardwood floor. Peering through the peephole. I saw nothing. The porch was empty. Bathed in the soft glow of the motion sensor light. "Hello?" I called out. My voice hesitant. There was no response. I stood there for a moment. My hand hovering over the lock. Debating whether to open the door. That's when I heard the voice, a man's voice. Low and pleading. "Please. I need help. My car broke down. Can you let me in?" The pit in my stomach told me something was wrong. The tone of his voice was off, too calm. Almost rehearsed. And if his car had really broken down, why hadn't I heard it pull up? Why would he knock on my door instead of going to the house down the street, which was much closer to the main road? "I'm sorry," I said, trying to sound firm. "I can't help you. Try the next house." There was silence for a moment. And then he spoke again. This time more insistent. "Please. It's freezing out here. I just need to use your phone." I backed away from the door. My heart pounding. The knocking resumed. Harder now. Echoing through the house. I grabbed my phone and called the police. Explaining the situation as calmly as I could. The knocking stopped before the officers arrived. They searched the area and found no one. "Probably just a prank," one of them said with a shrug. "Kids messing around." But as they drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day passed without incident. I told myself it was over. That whoever had knocked on my door had moved on. By the time evening rolled around, I had almost convinced myself that the entire thing had been harmless. That night, I was invited to a Halloween party at a friend's house. It was a welcome distraction. And I stayed out later than I had planned. By the time I got home, it was just after midnight. As I approached the house, I noticed something strange. The front door was locked, just as I had left it. But the basement door, the one at the side of the house, was slightly ajar. My stomach turned. I always kept that door locked. I hesitated on the porch, debating whether to go inside or call someone to check it out with me. But the rational part of my brain took over, assuring me it was nothing. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The house was dark and quiet, just as I had left it. But something felt off. I turned on the lights and set my keys on the counter, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. That's when I heard it. A faint clicking sound, coming from below. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails tapping against a hard surface. It was coming from the basement. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and approached the basement door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't just ignore it either. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The clicking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and suffocating. Then, from the darkness below, a voice whispered, "You're finally home." I screamed, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the knife as I backed away, my heart racing. I called the police again, barely able to get the words out as I explained what had happened. When they arrived, they searched the basement thoroughly but found nothing. No intruder. No signs of forced entry, nothing to explain what I had heard. The officer in charge tried to reassure me, but his tone was strained. "Sometimes houses make strange noises," he said. "Maybe you're just tired." I didn't believe him. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak of the house sending my nerves into overdrive. I kept the knife by my side, flinching at every shadow and sound. The next morning, I installed new locks on every door and window. I bought a security system with cameras, floodlights, and alarms. But no matter how many precautions I took, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was knocking on my window that night, or how they managed to disappear without a trace. And the voice I heard in the basement still haunts me, replaying in my mind whenever I'm alone. You're finally home. If you've ever been in a situation like this, where the comfort of your own home was shattered by something inexplicable, share your story in the comments. How did you handle it? Would you have opened the basement door? Or would you have run? These 6 stories remind us of something we often forget: the line between the natural and the supernatural is thinner than we'd like to believe. Whether it's an eerie melody in the woods, a shadow outside your RV, or a knock at the window, the unknown has a way of finding us when we least expect it. What's the scariest thing you've experienced? Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Or heard a sound you couldn't explain? Share your stories in the comments below, I'd love to hear them. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells for more chilling stories. Your support helps keep these haunting tales alive, and there are plenty more waiting to be told. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, it's what you can't explain.